calf skin gone soft with time, its edges chewed by the teeth of silverfish, its brass clasp gone green with corrosion. When archivist Caroline Dunn opened it in the dim light of the Valentine Museum's basement in Richmond, she thought at first it was another plantation inventory, those thousands of cryptic records that quietly outlived the people they catalogued. But then she saw the entries, written in the same neat female hand, dated spring 1849, and each line marked with an ornate cipher, a coiled serpent wound about a letter B. In the margins were names: Lena, Judah, Cassius, Ben. Below, in smaller lettering, Shared Thursday. Caroline's fingers trembled. At first she assumed shared referred to labor. Field or household duties rotated among estates. But as she turned the pages, she saw other notes, almost littered with intimacy. Washed at Hannah's spring house, returned at dawn, marked upon shoulder. And the signatures, women's signatures, written with a flourished hand that reeked of private schools and inherited silver. When word of the discovery reached the museum board, they urged silence. Richmond in 2021 was already a city uneasy with its ghosts. What the ledger implied could stain the name still carved into street signs and hospital wings. Yet the ledger would not stay buried. It whispered of a secret circle, wealthy women in antebellum Virginia who had formed what they called the Profane Brotherhood. Not a church, not a charity, something darker. Within its pages were hints of gatherings by candlelight in the cellars of colonial homes, of whispered oaths, and of enslaved men brought as offerings, or playthings, passed between households that outwardly preached virtue. Then came the rumors of sudden deaths, a fire that erased one mansion entirely, and the disappearance of a court clerk whose last known possession was a letter sealed with the same coiled serpent mark. The story that followed would unravel nearly a century later, as historians and descendants fought to conceal or confront it. The count of lives affected, if ever truly known, could reach into the dozens. Bodies vanished, families torn apart, reputations built upon silence. Before we continue with the story of the Profane Brotherhood, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. In the spring of 1849, Richmond was a city dressed in contradiction, half capital of refinement, half furnace of cruelty. The air smelled of magnolia blossoms mingled with tobacco smoke and tallow, soldiering the lungs of every passer-by. Along the cobbled streets, carriages rattled by with the golden crests of old Tidewater families carved into their doors. Beneath their wheels, barefoot boys, some free, many enslaved, scurried with parcels, scolded by drivers wearing starched collars gone yellow from June sweat. And it was a city of steeples and auction blocks. From Shockoe Hill's brick churches rose the hymns of piety, while only streets away, at the Shockoe Bottom Market, men and women were weighed and priced. To visitors from the north, Richmond pretended a gentility. The grand columns, the constant smell of roses near Capitol Square. But those who lived there long knew the charm was a mask stretched over unease. One could not ignore the whistles at night, the unspoken rules about who could walk where, nor the occasional scream carried from the alleys to vanish before reaching the judge's ear. The year itself wore unease like a fever. The Mexican-American War had ended only the year before, and young veterans with empty pockets haunted the taverns. The railroads, promising modern prosperity, were cutting through farmland like knives, while rumors of abolitionist pamphlets arriving by mail gave the city's elite a new appetite for secrecy. And among the women of those families, the Randolphs, the Pages, the Tuckers, a different restlessness stirred. Their lives were measured by etiquette, Sunday pews, and the strict assurances of their husbands' wealth. They entertained, they embroidered, they suffered births and fevers. Yet beneath the lace gloves, Many felt trapped in the very refinements meant to honor them. Some turned to seances, others to imported French novels describing passions unspoken in Virginia drawing rooms. When the newspapers carried serialized accounts of European scandals, the Dowager Duchess in Milan accused of unnatural indulgence with her servants. It sparked conversations whispered behind closed parlor doors. The South's caste system extended equally to its women. Even the mistresses of great houses were property in everything but name. Their bodies and decisions promised to the maintenance of family reputation. If there is one truth the ledger exposes, it is that power does not merely corrupt, it conspires. For these women, denied political voice, the enslaved body became the only realm where they could practice control. And control, by its nature, rarely wears the face of mercy. Now, imagine a city dusk in late spring, the river carrying the smell of silt and cotton bales, the market house bell tolling the evening hour. A carriage drawn by bay horses stops at a discreet back gate on Franklin Street. The lamps on the carriage are hooded, giving only thin bands of light that flash and vanish. Inside are two women dressed almost alike, dark traveling coats, bonnets pulled low. One whispers, "Is she waiting?" The other answers, "She is always waiting." Behind the gate, a house servant leads them through a narrow corridor into a wine cellar lit by a handful of tallow candles. The stone walls sweat with moisture. 6 other women stand there, each holding a book or a vial. At the far end of the table rests a polished mirror draped in black cloth and, beside it, a simple wooden stool. The ritual, if ritual it could be called, was not written in any church record. What the ledger suggests is a blend of Gothic play acting and sincere transgression. Readings from Scripture turned inside out, the Psalms recited backward, symbolic baptisms meant to purge shame by declaring sin as sovereign, and always, according to 2 later testimonies, there was one brought in. The ledger rarely named these men, but their initials followed each meeting's entry, like ghosts attached to the page. Outside this hidden world, Richmond's public life glittered as usual. The city's elite attended the theater, where traveling British actors recited Shakespeare for audiences who applauded more for etiquette than conviction. The newspapers filled with trade reports, duels, and returns from the General Assembly. Few suspected that within 3 blocks of the governor's mansion, a quiet sub-society of women was conducting gatherings that would, in time, become police rumor, then moral scandal, then whispered legend. Beneath the marble calm of Richmond's Episcopal steeples, the clergy fought their own private wars. Reverend Silas Dade of St. Paul's preached weekly against female vanity and the infection of modern books, an allusion, parish rumor claimed, to whispered stories of women's circles practicing private rites. Dade himself would later perish in a strange fever after a visit to a parishioner tied to the Brotherhood, though official records said complications of the lung. Elsewhere, the free black community in Jackson Ward had begun noticing curious events, young men vanishing after being hired for odd night work, then reappearing days later with eyes hollow and scars across their backs that seemed deliberate, ceremonial. They spoke little of it. To speak too openly was to invite lash or worse. But one washerwoman, Charity Ames, told a magistrate months later that she saw fine ladies wrapped as travelers leading a man like he was drunk back from the river bridge. Her statement never made it to court. The clerk assigned to her file would later disappear, leaving behind a desk marked by a melted candle and one blackened wax seal, serpent-shaped. The social landscape of the South in 1849 nurtured its own horrors quietly. The moral structure built around slavery already relied on submission enforced by violence. But the peculiar revelations in the Brotherhood ledger suggested something unprecedented. A collaboration of elite women using enslaved men not merely for labor, but for an inversion of authority and humiliation. Whether the acts were sexual, ritual, or both remains partly veiled. but the records bristle with phrases like rebellion quenched in sanctified shame. Even more unsettling was the language of fellowship, this idea that sin itself was holy if confessed among equals. The recorded oath, deciphered 2 generations later, read, "What men deny us, we shall claim in shadow, and that shadow shall be blameless." In that single line lies the seed of both rebellion and damnation. Through surviving diaries of Richmond's upper class, one can trace the city's rhythm that year. The summer droughts, the methodical Sunday routines, the grand balls at Mayo's Hall, where candlelight glittered off military medals and silk gowns. Beneath the violins, gossip swirled in currents. One matron, writing anonymously to a cousin in Williamsburg, mentioned a sisterhood of midnight confession whose members grow pale as milk by autumn. The letter was dismissed as fancy, yet her description matched household records later confirmed as belonging to 2 women named in the ledger's first pages. To walk Richmond's night streets, then, was to smell more than the river. Along the slave jail on 15th Street, chains clinked like wind chimes when mist rolled in. Dogs barked at nothing. A watchman recalled seeing figures, women, moving from carriage to carriage, their shoes flashing white under lamp glow. When he challenged them, one answered only, "Mind your post, sir. We tend souls here." That phrase would return decades later in witness testimonies, a password of sorts among those who believed the Brotherhood was more than a social scandal, that it was a devotional heresy. Its members, all proper wives by day, seemed to chase a liberation so dangerous it could exist only under cover of sin. Today, the streets those women walked are paved over with parking lots and office towers. Yet, under Richmond's skin, traces remain. Old tunnels near Church Hill, bricked over cisterns rumored to lead to cellars that once echoed with chants, now lost. Archaeologists found fragments of broken glass etched with letters too small to read, preserved beneath ash from one of the city's mysterious 1851 warehouse fires. Some whisper the fire was no accident, that it began in a meeting place of the Brotherhood whose host had threatened confession to her priest. The proof, like smoke, drifted away. But what remains are names like Lydia Brooke, Marion Dupree, and Ellen Page, some later married to judges or senators, all united under that single, troubling emblem, the serpent about the letter B. And every story has its beginning not in revelation, but denial. What took place in Richmond that summer would ruin lives, obscure records, and eventually produce testimonies so disturbing the city elders sealed them for a century. Yet, sometimes, the past pries open its own grave, and with that little ledger, the grave was opened again. Continue prompt needed for next section. You are a master dark investigative storyteller. Your role is to write a deeply immersive, historically detailed horror mystery script for my YouTube long-form documentary narration channel. The script must feel like a mix of a Netflix true crime documentary and a Gothic investigative chronicle. Input: The Profane Brotherhood, Richmond's elite women who shared their male slaves, 1849. Script requirements: target total length 8,000, 9,000 words, 30-45 minutes. Output section by section, approximately 1,500, 2,000 words each. End each section with continue prompt needed for next section. Never auto-continue until I command. Structural blueprint target, word count. Opening hook, approximately 250, 350 words. Cold open on a shocking, eerie discovery/event tied to a physical artifact. Promise scope, body count, cover-up, powerful families. End with a natural one-sentence CTA. Before we continue with the story of anchor figure event, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. Historical context setting. Approximately 600–900 words. Situate the viewer in the exact time-place. Describe America's social, political, and cultural environment in that period. Use vivid descriptive imagery: streets, churches, farms, voices, smells. Character introductions. Approximately 500–700 words per character. Introduce key people, victims, suspects, families. Provide physical appearance, psychological traits, fears, ambitions. Always embed at least 2 snippets of realistic dialogue per major character. First signs of horror mystery. Approximately 600–900 words. Early warnings, strange local rumors, small unexplained incidents. Build subtle dread, foreshadowing of greater darkness. Escalation suspicion. Approximately 2,000–2,300 words, may split. Fear grows in the town. Eyewitnesses testify. Doctors, priests, journalists, family. Each layer deepens complexity. Include dialogue, subtle psychology to sustain immersion. Example CTA here, midpoint comment push. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Revelation climax of horror. Approximately 2,200–2,500 words, may split. Expose the full horror. Rituals, murders, conspiracy, or supernatural undertones. Blend theological, philosophical, or occult commentary to heighten realism. Create gut-punch revelations, but never break immersion with outside narrator tone. Add another subtle engagement CTA. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. Aftermath societal impact. Approximately 900–1,200 words. Trials, newspaper headlines, legal consequences. Wider effect on the community, families, and national psyche. Closing reflection. CTA. Approximately 120–180 words. End with haunting questions. Full CTA for comment/like/subscription. Example. So, what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled, or was it buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story. Tone style rules. Investigative, immersive, and documentary. Language must be simple enough for a general American audience, but emotionally heavy and cinematic. Use vivid descriptive detail, sounds, smells, scenes. Include historically accurate references, religion, law, culture of the period. Horror undertone must always be subtle, creeping, uncanny. Avoid modern slang. Maintain 19th/early 20th century seriousness. Dialogue must feel real, tense, and human. End each section with continue prompt needed for next section. Hard rules. Never summarize. Always write in pure story narrative. No bullet points or numbered lists inside the script. No section titles or headings in the narrated output. Only seamless narration. Maintain flow like a story, not an essay. Never break structure until the full 7K, 9K word script is done. Begin now by writing Section 1, Opening Hook Historical. If the ledger gave us whispers, the surviving letters give us faces. Even the faintest ones, traced in iron gall ink and brittle with time, seem to smudge with unease, as though the paper itself recoiled from memory. From those fragments, historians reconstructed 3 figures around whom the story coiled like smoke: Lydia Brooke, Marion Dupre, and Ellen Page. Together they formed the spine of what the ledger called, with unsettling pride, the Profane Brotherhood. Lydia Brooke was 32 in 1849, mistress of a sprawling tobacco estate west of the city limits, where the James River curved like a spine around the fields. Her father had been one of the Commonwealth's wealthiest exporters, leaving her a radius of barns, overseers, and 31 enslaved people at the age of 21. A portrait painted that year shows a woman with a gaze unnervingly direct, dark hair pulled tight, lips thin as drawn string. Local accounts describe her voice as calm, but unkindly precise, the kind that made even older men listen. She had married young, to a Colonel Philemon Brooke, who departed for the war in Mexico and returned changed, stricken by fever, hobbled, and increasingly drunk. Family records mention no children, though a single unmarked grave near the family chapel bears the date, 1843. Some say she carried a child to term that winter and buried it herself under the frost. When neighbors called, they found her often wandering her gardens at twilight, her gown hem-soaked from the dew. One testimony, given decades later by a descendant of one of the house servants, recalled hearing her voice through the open library windows, speaking not to her husband, but to the empty air. "I will take no confession but my own," she said, low and steady, "and I will forgive myself when priests will not." In that strange defiance lies her lure, the kind that drew others, particularly women of means who felt the church's comfort turned to judgment. Lydia's home became known for gatherings billed as literary evenings. Attendees arrived with books bound in silk and left long after midnight. What the servants saw, or thought they saw, was written later in the county's slave narratives. Candles arranged in rings, a silver mirror set upon a wine cask, and the faint humming of hymns reversed in tune. Whether Lydia believed in dark rites or only enjoyed the rebellion of imitation, nobody could later say. But by the time the ledger began, her name appeared at the head of each entry, always signed with that serpent mark. Marion Dupree entered the circle from a different door. Born in New Orleans to a Creole father and a Charleston mother, Marion carried the polished affectations of a cosmopolitan world that made Richmond whisper but secretly envy. She came north after marrying Achilles Dupree, a shipping merchant who invested in molasses and rumors. His trade required him away for months at a time, which left Marion managing both a household and her loneliness. Descriptions of her vary depending on who wrote them. A Richmond maid described her as small, quick, and full of laughter like a bird trapped in a parlor. A neighbor's son, writing to a friend in Petersburg, said she was the finest-looking woman this side of the Potomac, but with eyes that never rest. She spoke fluent French and was seen promenading alone by the riverbanks with a sketchbook, behavior scandalous enough to draw sidelong glances. Her surviving diary, found in a trunk unearthed from the ruins of her house after the 1865 fires, offers glimpses into her descent toward Lydia's circle. In one entry, dated early April 1849, her handwriting trembles. "There is talk among the ladies of devotion without priests, faith without rule. They say our bodies are but instruments the Lord forgot how to play. I do not know whether to laugh or listen." 3 weeks later she wrote again. "LB says a woman need only reverse the prayer to reverse her shame. I told her she tempts damnation. She answered, 'Damnation is but liberty pronounced backward.'" That phrase, liberty pronounced backward, would echo among the coded lines of the ledger. For Marion, it marked transformation. Her sketches from that period shifted from riverside imagery to darker visions, masked figures, lit candles on water, men bound in posture of supplication. Many pages were later cut out deliberately, their edges burned. Ellen Page was younger than either of them, scarcely 20, daughter of a judge whose reputation for severity could silence even senators. She had grown up in a mansion overlooking Capitol Square, her world a strict pattern of lessons, servants, and sermons. When her mother died of fever in 1847, Ellen became the judge's companion, attending dinners and social calls that bored her numb. Letters between her and a school friend reveal a mind both sharp and quietly mutinous. Father says a woman's virtue is a mirror that cracks if breathed upon. Then let mine shatter, she wrote in one note smuggled from the Randolph Seminary. By 1849, she had met Lydia through church auxiliaries and became a silent devotee. Witnesses later claimed she followed Lydia like a shadow at receptions, asking questions cloaked as compliments. It was Ellen's handwriting that appears in the ledger beside complex ciphers, suggesting she served as chronicler for the Brotherhood's assemblies. To all outward society, she was innocence incarnate, blue-eyed, pale, demure. Beneath it, something restless stirred. Servant accounts from the Page household mention her returning from outings near dawn, the hems of her gown smeared with ash, carrying a bundle she guarded like scripture. When rebuked, she reportedly whispered, "You cannot confess me out of it, Father. This is between women." What bound these women together was more than curiosity. It was resentment against invisible laws that governed everything from their hair to their souls. The South insisted its ladies be saints in silk, but Lydia, Marian, and Ellen chafed at sainthood. In their eyes, rebellion, even profane rebellion, felt like breath itself. Their union first found form in Lydia's parlor, beneath portraits of ancestors in powdered wigs. On a March evening, as thunder rolled beyond the shutters, Lydia reportedly turned from the fire and asked the others, "If God made us less than men, must we be less in every sense?" Marian smiled, fingers curling around her wine glass. "Perhaps he left that question for us to answer." Ellen, seated by the pianoforte, struck a chord and murmured, "Then let's answer in his own tongue, by reversal." Whether that was the true origin of the Brotherhood's rites, or simply later embellishment, one cannot say. But around that season, the ledger's entries begin, Night of Confession without priest, marked in silver upon flesh. The first page, born in Ellen's neat script, bears each of their initials entwined, sealed with wax traced in serpentine loops. Yet a movement, even a secret one, cannot live without echo. Behind every mistress stood servants who saw more than their employers realized. Among those fragments of recollection comes the faint, crucial presence of Judah, an enslaved man who served in the Brooke household stables. What little is known of him survives in oral memory, recorded a century later by his granddaughter. She claimed Judah was broad-shouldered, eyes quiet as the river, and walked like someone listening for thunder. He had once been rented to another plantation for carpentry and returned with an injury across his shoulder that never fully healed. In the testimonies that surfaced long after the war, Judah appears in connection to a night described cryptically as the first offering. Whether that term means sexual violation, ritual humiliation, or both remains uncertain. But according to the retold account, he was summoned late one evening under pretense of repairing cellar steps. Lydia was waiting. Marian arrived later with a wine decanter, Ellen carrying a small mirror draped in ribbon. Judah's name appears beside that date in the ledger, followed by the chilling marginalia. Obedience enacted, baptism complete. 2 months later, Judah vanished. The official record shows him sold south for incorrigible behavior. No further trace. Only his granddaughter's voice endures, captured in a crackling 1937 recording from the WPA Oral History Project. "They said my granddaddy run. I think he run into something dreadful. They said the white ladies took him that night, and next day there was blood in the well." That single phrase, "blood in the well," became folklore among Richmond's black community. Some swore the Brooke estate's water soured afterward. Others claimed a faint humming, half hymn, half lullaby, could be heard if one lingered at those ruins past dusk. In the polished halls of Richmond society, no such whispers were tolerated. Publicly, the Brooke and Duper houses gleamed with respectability. Lydia donated to the orphanage fund. Marian organized concerts for the suffering poor. Ellen played the church organ under the approving gaze of her father. Yet beneath these acts pulsed a current of secrecy they refused to surrender. When the city prepared for its summer fair that year, Marion suggested hosting a ladies' committee meeting at Lydia's estate. Neighbors recalled wagons arriving under cover of dusk, their windows shuttered tight against the evening sun. Inside, something took place that would soon draw attention from even the authorities, a sound that made the overseer drop his lantern and cross himself, chanting, low and slow, interspersed with laughter that was not laughter at all. Later, when Lydia's cook entered to clean, she found droplets of wax pooled in circles on the cellar floor and a scent sweet and coppery, as though wine had spoiled with metal. It is possible the women had merely performed a pageant, inspired by the Gothic novels then in fashion. Yet the ledger page from that same date reads, Second Confession, New Vow upon the Spirit of Judah, Fire as Witness. What remains most haunting about these figures is their duality. In daylight they embodied Southern womanhood, gentility, piety, grace. By night they plunged into an inverted world of shadows and mirrors, seeking freedom through corruption. Their story reminds us that evil rarely arrives foaming at the mouth. More often it sips tea from porcelain cups and pays its tithes on Sunday. If one listened closely in Richmond that year, tongues were already wagging. The clergyman, Reverend Dade, began preaching against the desecration of divine order among our sisters. The Richmond Whig ran a cryptic editorial decrying female impiety masquerading as education clubs. The gossip that followed might have ended as mere moral panic, had not an incident only weeks later pushed rumor toward terror. An overseer at one of the Brotherhood estates was found dead, face down in the shallows of the James, his skin marred with a curling pattern burned into the flesh. A serpent about the letter B. His death would mark the first undeniable bloodstain in the tale of the Profane Brotherhood. The summer of 1849 came in dry and electric. Thunderstorms prowled the edges of the sky but rarely broke, and the air seemed to hang heavier by the day, as though the city itself were holding its breath. The James River ran low and sluggish, its shallows clogging with reeds, and down in Shockoe Bottom, the butcher's stalls began to stink a day after slaughter. It was in this suffocating heat that the first rumors began to move, a slow contagion of whispers that crept from servant quarters to parlor staircases. Something had happened upriver at the Brooklands, something that polite society pretended not to hear but could not stop imagining. A fisherman named George Tyner found the body at dawn. His skiff scraped something heavy beneath the bridge pilings. A man, face down, his back swollen and pale, his shirt blackened with river muck. When Tyner turned him over, he saw the mark. Burned into the flesh between shoulder blades was a coiled design, and within it, the faint brand-like letter B. It appeared deliberate, ornamental, yet not the crude iron scarring common to plantations. It looked, he later said, more like a seal made for paper than a mark made for man. The sheriff arrived before noon, along with a physician accustomed to treating heat stroke and snakebite, but seldom such mutilation. The corpse was identified as Thomas Cale, an overseer in Colonel Brooks' employ. Rumor claimed drink and misstep had sent him into the river, but Tyner, the fisherman, told anyone who'd listen. He had that mark before he was dead. It weren't no accident burned him so clean. By evening, every alehouse from the courthouse to Rocket's carried some variation of the story. How Cale had offended his mistress, how the devil took him, how others heard unholy singing upriver that same night. At the City Hotel, a trader from Norfolk spoke loudly to impress companions. They say the Brook women got a society, meeting under moonlight and all. Heard tell the Reverend himself tried to nose around and fell sick soon after. Fever, they claim, but fever don't draw symbols on flesh. Across town, in the darkened servant kitchens where candles burned short, The talk was more cautious. House servants who once worked near the Brook estate remembered seeing lanterns on the riverbank, women's voices chanting together, and something that sounded like crying. A cook from the Dupré household swore she heard her mistress call out a man's name long after midnight. Then the crackle of distant flame. Within weeks, another odd occurrence rippled through gossip. A stray servant boy, no more than 12, found wandering disoriented along the road toward Manchester. When questioned by a farmer who found him, the boy babbled about white ladies in dark gowns washing a man with smoke. The farmer thought it nonsense, until the boy began scratching a shape into the dust with a broken twig. First the curve of a snake, then the looping letter beneath its jaw. The farmer crossed himself, gave the boy bread, and sent him eastward, warning that sometimes the Lord's countryside grows foul with things unblessed. By the time word of the boy reached the city, he had disappeared. Even high society could no longer completely deny what the poorer folk murmured. By July, the death of Thomas Cale became officially unmentionable, but the tension it introduced lingered like humidity. Lydia Brooke withdrew from routine social calls. Colonel Brooke, perpetually drunk, was seen wandering his veranda, muttering about women's folly leading to hellfire. Marion Dupré canceled her scheduled charity recital without explanation, claiming illness. Only Ellen Page continued to appear in public, though observers noted her pallor and trembling. One guest at a theater performance wrote to a cousin that Ellen clutched her prayer book tight as though afraid it might speak. Inside her family's mansion on Grace Street, the mirrors were said to be shrouded in muslin, a mourning practice for which there was no death notice. Servants claimed her father, Judge Page, kept a pistol on his desk now, something unseen before. When a neighbor asked kindly after Miss Ellen, the judge's only reply was, "She has learned more than any woman should." On the night of August the 11th, the weather finally broke. A storm swept up from the Blue Ridge, ripping shingles and uprooting trees. With it came a power outage of its own century, a city plunged into darkness by wind and rain. During that chaos, a fire ignited at the edge of the Brooke property. The flames consumed a storage barn and part of the south gallery before dawn rain damped them out. Witnesses said they saw lightning strike, yet the pattern of burn suggested something intentional. Inside the blackened ruins, investigators found melted glass candles, a circle of iron candlesticks, and the stone rim of what looked disturbingly like a baptismal font, its surface scored with symbols. Lydia told the sheriff it had been a ladies' meeting gone awry, some spilled lamp oil. Her tone, recorded in later journals, remained eerily even. But when the sheriff turned to leave, she said something that lingered. "You will not find the storm's reason in ashes, sir." That same week, parishioners at St. Paul's noticed a man, gaunt with river scars on his arms, praying near the back pew. He gave no name, only whispered that he sought forgiveness for carrying the wrong mirror. When the constable approached him after service, the man fled, vanishing through the narrow alleys leading toward Shockoe Slip. What he meant by the wrong mirror became a subject of fascination among the few who heard. Some claimed he was a freedman who had once served the Brooke household. Others believed he was one of the Brotherhood's victims returned to haunt the city in flesh rather than spirit. Either way, his phrase stuck, the wrong mirror. In months to come, it would take on an unsettling clarity. By autumn, the city's moralists began pressing for investigation. The sermons grew sterner, warning against female idolatry and unnatural enlightenment. Reverend Dade, now recovering from his mysterious sickness, thundered from his pulpit about Judases born in silk. But as quickly as tongues wagged, official measures faltered. Each time a witness stepped forward, influence or fear silenced them. A constable who promised evidence abruptly resigned and left Richmond altogether. The rumor among tavern men was that he'd stumbled on a hidden room beneath Lydia's house, an arched cellar lined with mirrors facing inward. their covers removed. The next morning, all those mirrors were supposedly gone, replaced by new ones still smelling of fresh silvering. In letters recovered much later, Ellen Page recorded disturbing dreams. Visions of water lit from below, men's faces looking upward through the surface, mouths open as if mid-prayer. One line, written in a shaking hand, reads, "He is beneath the well still. We draw from him." No researcher has been able to determine whether this was metaphor or memory. During that same season, a series of inexplicable illnesses spread among 3 households associated with the women: coughs, fainting fits, one sudden blindness. A local physician believed the cause to be lamp vapor inhaled in cellars, yet his notes admit the patients all bore identical burns on their wrists, small and circular, as though sealed with metal. When Marian regained her senses after one such episode, she reportedly turned to her maid and murmured, "Do you know what is worse than sin? To find that the sin prayed back." Then she fell silent for days, refusing to eat. The rising fear was not confined to Richmond. Newspapers in Petersburg and Fredericksburg began reprinting scandalous little items referencing the Women's Covenant of Richmond. They called it witch play, or a perversion of Christian piety. The more the clergy dismissed it as gossip, the more it fascinated the public. Songs even emerged in taverns, mocking verses hinting at ladies who love the lash. But in the countryside where the first blood had been found, men and women spoke differently. The enslaved population regarded those fields as cursed. One former field hand testified years later that no one would drink from the brook well. Animals balked and whined near it. At harvest time, overseers reported seeing smoke rise from the ground when fog rolled thick over the river. By October, another man was missing. A stable hand named Cassius, last seen bringing feed to the horses at dusk. Lydia told his kin he'd run away under cover of storm, but within days the dogs howled at night and refused to pass the pasture's old oak. Beneath it, children later discovered small tokens arranged in a ring, remnants of ribbon, melted wax, and what appeared to be a mirror shard no larger than a coin. On its back, scratched crudely with iron, was that snake sigil once more. In downtown Richmond, Ellen Page's father finally sought counsel from fellow magistrates. Judges and lawyers assembled behind shuttered windows, debating how to contain a scandal that, if exposed, would blacken the reputations of half their families. The record of that meeting remains locked away, but one surviving fragment from a participant's private notes reads simply, "If crimes were committed, they are beyond statute and reason. To summon light here is to make the pest breathe." It was decided that the matter would simply not exist. Clergy were instructed to quiet parish talk, sheriffs to close their files, yet secrets do not vanish when decreed. They turn inward, festering. That winter, a desperate quiet fell. Lydia rarely left her estate. Marian was seen walking at night along the riverbank, muttering prayers in French. Ellen retreated entirely from society. Curiously, the city itself seemed to follow their decline, a series of collapses, drownings, fevers, each scribbled in the dispatch's small columns, but never linked publicly. The river claimed more lives than any winter before. In December, a new entry appeared on the final page of the ledger, later found water-damaged but legible enough to chill the blood. 3 made 1. To keep his mirror still, the well sealed in grace. Our brother remains. Light would scatter the image, so darkness must feed it. The handwriting is Ellen's. After that, there were no more records. The brotherhood appears to dissolve, swiftly, almost as though swallowed. By spring 1850, Marian and her husband had sailed for Europe. Lydia stayed behind but withdrew completely, shuttering parts of her estate. Ellen, rumor said, was sent to a sanatorium near Charlottesville, carrying only a small book clasped to her chest. Yet the silence that followed was not peace. Around midsummer came reports of moaning from the brook well, the same well whose stones bore faint scorch marks. Neighbors claimed to hear it on moonless nights, timed somehow to the ticking of the courthouse clock miles away. Colonel Brooke finally ordered the well filled. Accounts say it took 15 wagon loads of dirt before the sound ceased. Even then, the farmhands refused to linger near it. Richmond moved on, as all cities do, its scandals buried under newer ones, its sinners replaced by others. But among those who remembered the summer of 1849, a phrase persisted, whispered by washerwomen and carriage drivers who knew when to hush their voices near the great houses. The well still breathes. And though the city's papers would not print it, each time another unexplained drowning or disappearance occurred along the James, someone always drew in dust or ash the mark of a serpent and a single letter B, a grim remembrance of the women who once sought holiness in sin and left their city haunted by the echo of their defiance. By the time the first snow fell in Richmond, what had begun as parlor scandal grew into something the city could no longer suppress with silence. The story spread without names attached, because the names were too high. Whisper became conviction, and conviction, rumor said, began devouring its own believers. The Brooke estate rotted behind its brick walls through that bone-cold winter. The colonel's drinking worsened. Lydia's servants slipped away at every chance, whispering that the house groaned at night like a ship straining in storm. Chimneys oozed smoke, though no fires were lit. Once, a passing traveler swore he saw a woman's face pressed against the attic pane, mouth opening as if in scream, yet no sound passed the glass. He could not tell if she was calling for rescue or welcoming someone unseen. Down in the city center, life attempted normalcy. Carriages still rolled past the governor's mansion. Merchants still bickered over freight costs. But church pews were thinner. Disease, an odd, sudden wasting, began its quiet work. Victims carried small blisters on their wrists that never healed, just reddened and itched like a brand resurrecting beneath the skin. The doctors called it lamp rash. Priests called it the Lord's rebuke. And in taverns, men began to call it the brotherhood mark. One bleak morning in February 1850, Reverend Silas Dade rose from bed to find his study filled with a stench of lamp oil and something iron-sweet. In the faint light he saw scrawled across his sermon papers in an elegant female hand, "Return the mirror. The water remembers." He burned the note, but the smell lingered for days. When he delivered his sermon the following Sabbath, his voice shook. "If the serpent teaches Eve to see herself," he warned his congregation, "then perhaps that is the oldest sin, the hunger to behold what heaven conceals." A hush hung heavy. Near the back, Judge Page sat stiffly beside his daughter. Ellen's veil hid her face, though those near her said her hands clenched convulsively, nails cutting skin. When a gust rattled the church windows, she rose abruptly, whispering something that made even the usher flinch. "The river feeds on truth." That moment marked a public tremor. After service, citizens gathered outside debating whether madness or confession had just spoken. Judge Page pushed his daughter into a carriage without a word and ordered the driver to take them home by side streets away from curious eyes. That night, the judge summoned 2 fellow magistrates and a deputy to his study. He wished, he said, to end the rumors and restore the Page family honor. The deputy recorded their exchange before later disappearing himself. The surviving fragment, preserved in an investigator's personal notebook, reads, "Judge Page. She has fallen among women who worship not God but reflection of their own flesh. I would remove her." Magistrate Wythe. "Remove her to where? The asylums are full of wives gone wayward." Page. "She speaks of a well. She hears hymns she has not heard. The doctor says nothing earthly ails her." Wythe. "Then pray she is haunted only by memory." Within a fortnight, Ellen vanished altogether. Servants at first assumed she'd been sent to relatives in Albemarle. Others swore they'd seen her walking past the Capitol steps just before dawn, barefoot, gown unfastened, a small looking-glass in hand. She was never officially declared dead, merely absent, presumed distant. Meanwhile, Lydia Brooke and Marion Dupre remained bound by their own secrecy. When Marion returned from Europe that spring, her ship docked amid rumors that she had been confined at sea for hysteria. The ship's physician described her as lucid at mealtimes, but prone to reciting Latin lines backward when the moon rose. Whether inspired by delirium or something learned before crossing the Atlantic, no one knew. Lydia drove to meet her upon arrival, her black coach waiting like a hearse beneath the bright harbor sunlight. Witnesses remembered the two women embracing not as friends delighted to reunite, but as conspirators clearing a debt. Lydia pressed a parcel into Marion's hands, wrapped in waxed cloth. A dock worker later insisted he saw blood spot through the wrapping, though the constable dismissed him as drunk. That evening, thunder rolled again. 2 nights later, fire consumed the Dupre townhouse in the city proper. Flames raced through the drawing room so fast that rescuers barely saved the lower floors. On the upper landing, they found signs of a bizarre scene. Mirrors arranged facing one another, smoke stains forming concentric circles on the wallpaper. In the center of the room, a bronze serpent figurine lay bent by heat, its base engraved with a single letter, B. Marion was rescued alive but hysterical. For weeks she muttered about voices in water and a child's face in the splash. When questioned by authorities, she insisted she had tried to destroy their eye, but failed, that the flame multiplied instead. On her deathbed months later, nurses recorded her last words, "The boy in the mirror breathes when I sleep." Events spiraled. Lydia, now utterly isolated, fell under civic suspicion. In May, Judge Page, haunted perhaps by guilt, petitioned the court for an inquiry into peculiar practices injurious to human dignity and safety. Behind closed doors, the inquiry convened. Wealthy families sent lawyers to smother exposure. Clergy pleaded for souls rather than justice. Journalists lurked like ravens outside the courthouse doors. The only tangible evidence arrived unexpectedly. A broken looking-glass dredged from the James by timbermen. Embedded within its frame was a strip of fabric, unmistakably part of a fine lady's cloak. The pattern on its fractured surface resembled firelight captured mid-motion, a glare that refused to fade even when polished away. One of the workmen, a young Irishman named Keating, carried the mirror piece home. Within a week, neighbors found him drowned in his own water trough, his hands bleeding from attempts to claw his reflection away. When that news reached the investigators, one clerk whispered, "The Brotherhood reclaims its tools." The trial of Lydia Brooke was quietly postponed and finally abandoned. None of her peers would testify. The only public statement came from Reverend Dade, who eulogized a society sickened by its own image. Richmond, desperate to end the contagion of talk, sought closure through pretense. Newspapers proclaimed the disappearance of Ellen Page as voluntary retreat for health. The Dupre fire was labeled accidental combustion of lamp oil. The so-called Mark sickness dwindled as winter passed. Yet the city's collective unease remained unchanged, a sleeping fever under the skin. The archives tell almost nothing of Lydia's final months, except a single letter, never sent, discovered decades later in a drawer sealed behind a false panel. The ink had faded to sepia, but its words, preserved carefully by museum hands, cut deep. "If confession could silence water, I would pray until the river dried. But water is older than pity. The well stirs when the moon wanes. It listens. I think sometimes the serpent was never cursed. It was simply misunderstood. Should any find this, bury it near the river. That is where I will wait." 3 weeks after that unsent letter, Colonel Brooke awoke alone, his wife's bed unslept, her slippers gone. He told the constable she must have gone to assist a sick neighbor. Her carriage tracks led only half a mile, to the same abandoned well once filled. Its stones were again disturbed, dirt freshly scattered. They never found Lydia. Later that spring, children fishing near the river mouth pulled up fragments of silk that writhed strangely underwater, as though caught on something breathing beneath the mud. By 1851, the city's outward life resumed, but a handful of men still privately tried to reckon with what they suspected. Among them was Dr. Henry Clay Gibbons, a physician fascinated, as physicians often are, by what frightens others. Gibbons collected testimonies from the remaining servants who had fled the Brooke estate. Some spoke reluctantly, others refused outright. But one, an elderly laundress named Charity Ames, the same woman who once reported seeing fine ladies leading a man like he was drunk, agreed to talk when promised she would not be named in record. Gibbons wrote that she trembled throughout the account but insisted on finishing. Her confession, when read aloud decades later, chilled even jaded historians. They say they wanted washing without soap, spirit washing. Some nights they take a man down there, make him kneel at the stone rim, and they sing over him. Sometimes the man scream, sometimes he don't. Then they make him look in the water. If he look too long, he don't stand again. Miss Lydia say it cleanse him. I say it eat him. After the one named Judah went, the frogs stopped croaking round that well, and the air smelled like copper. Dr. Gibbons sealed that testimony, perhaps fearing ridicule or repercussions. He too would vanish from record 2 years later after a boating accident. His notes, retrieved from his office chest, ended with one unfinished line: "The well is not whole, but glass." Years later, long after the Civil War altered Richmond beyond recognition, a generation still whispered of that feverish year. Old veterans sitting in the courthouse square spoke of nights when the river glowed faintly at its bend. Washerwomen refused to bathe clothes near certain stones. Yet it was a young journalist from the Dispatch, Thomas Red, who unearthed forgotten records while researching the epidemic of 1849. Red traced patterns, unexplained drownings, identical injuries, even the identical phrasing in coroner reports, flesh branded clean as paper. He compiled an exposé but never published it. Instead, his editor received a sealed envelope containing only one page, the serpent and the letter B, ink fresh, drawn with alarming steadiness. Red resigned the next day, claiming exhaustion. And so the secret carried on, generation after generation, a wound beneath Richmond's grand facades, reopened by every drought, every archaeological dig that struck bone where only brick was expected. By midsummer of 1851, Judge Page succumbed to pneumonia. His estate inventory listed, among the late man's possessions, a cracked mirror described as for destruction. Before officers could seize it, the mirror vanished, along with the caretaker charged to deliver it. Some swore they saw a woman cloaked in black taking a covered object toward the river that same dawn. Whether fate, conscience, or unfinished covenant drew her there, no one could tell. People still argued over the meaning of the serpent emblem. Some said it symbolized defiance of patriarchal order, others the devil claiming gentility. Yet every theory returned to the well, to water, to reflection, the notion that the women sought not merely pleasure but transcendence, and found in themselves not angels nor demons, but both. Whatever truth hides there, Richmond never dared dig again. The tale might have ended there, gossip bleeding into folklore, names fading beneath marble headstones. But the city's memory is porous. In the 1880s, demolition workers uncovering old foundations by Main Street reported a sealed chamber lined entirely with silver-backed glass. Within lay a single chair and traces of melted candle. One man touched the wall and claimed his reflection, blinked though his own eyes were still. He quit the next day and left for Baltimore, refusing pay. Each retelling, each echo, adds a layer to the legend of the profane brotherhood, the women who turned mirror into altar, who claimed dominion over sin itself, and in so doing, blurred the line between liberation and annihilation. Perhaps their actions were rebellion twisted grotesque by shame. Perhaps something older than them whispered through broken scripture and starvation of the soul. Those who seek to judge them face the same peril as those women faced staring into that water. That moment when gaze meets its twin and can no longer tell which one looks alive. So I ask you now, as historians and audience alike have asked for a century and a half, what do you think? Guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Fog rolled off the James like a shroud. It was August of 1851 when the first real confession surfaced, not by choice, but by illness. Marion Dupre's servants found her raving, feverish, lips cracked from muttering the same passage over and over. A priest was summoned, but she refused absolution until he promised to let the water testify. Whatever that meant, he agreed, hoping to calm her. The following afternoon, escorted by 2 attendants, they carried her sedan chair down to the blackened grounds of the burned Brook estate, now overrun with nettle and browned weeds. Lydia was gone, the colonel long since fled south. Only the stone rim of the sealed well remained, half buried under years of neglect. Marion pointed at it with skeletal hands. "There," she rasped. "The breath is trapped. We sealed it. We thought it mercy." The priest demanded clarity, but she continued as if speaking to invisible listeners. "We made a covenant, Father, to wash away possession, of us, of them, of all flesh doomed by men's choosing. But the mirror was not window, it was mouth." When he dared remove the cover of dirt over the well, a foul vapor rose, thick as the smoke from a blown-out candle. The priest collapsed, eyes watering. In that second, the attendants swore they heard the muttering echo. Marion's voice multiplied underground, whispering from every direction. They hauled her away, screaming that the brother still drinks the moonlight. That night she died, convulsing, and her death certificate, signed by that same priest, read simply, "Paralysis of the heart." What those men experienced spread underground faster than plague. The priest, whose diary survives, wrote privately of dreams following the incident. "I see below the surface a man's silhouette kneeling in water that glows faintly, as though reflecting not the moon but something deeper. He lifts his head to breathe, and when I shout the name of God, his face becomes that of a woman I cannot name." After this vision, the clergyman resigned from St. Paul's, took refuge in Maryland, and was found drowned in a cistern within a year. What had these women uncovered? Later discovery of Ellen Page's hidden writings, tucked inside hymnals donated to a charity, offered the only coherent explanation scholars have. They were fragments, lines of Latin, French, and warped scripture, but when pieced together, they suggested a philosophy half theological, half madness, that the act of enslavement itself could invert through ritual. The enslaver and the enslaved would mirror each other until neither owned nor obeyed. "We will reflect until reflection breaks," she wrote. "Then only the soul will look back." To embody this reversal, they used literal mirrors and candlelight, chanting psalms backward until their own faces blurred into shadow. Some passages mention water, the only glass God cannot yet command. Their experiments sought transformation, the pure reversal of dominance, not through justice, but through mimicry of oppression. What began as a grotesque moral exercise became, in their eyes, sacrament. One of Ellen Page's reads like a confession. "Judah knelt first. He did not understand. We sang his name as prayer. He thought we mocked him. The heat rose, his breath and ours the same, and then no one commanded. He stood as we knelt. The water brightened, showed his face in mine. I think we changed place. I do not know who came out. That terrible line haunted every historian who saw it. It implied the unthinkable, that the Brotherhood's rite sought not mere pleasure or cruelty, but a metaphysical exchange between master and servant, between power and bondage. Perhaps it was symbolic. Perhaps something else answered. In September, heavy floods struck the low fields. The James, swollen and furious, broke its banks, swallowing the entire brook property. Workers reported that when the water receded, the ground nearest the old well glistened as if filmed by glass. Plants won't grow there to this day. Among the debris, they found an iron strongbox wedged between roots. Inside lay what looked like a woman's diary coated in dried clay and soot. The first pages were blank, but midway through, words emerged, faded yet precise. It was Lydia Brooke's own hand, written likely days before her disappearance. August 9th. Silence from the others. Marion speaks no sense. Ellen gone to light she cannot return from. The mark raises on my wrist again at each tide change. I sense him awake below. If freedom means drowning, perhaps that is baptism's true face. The serpent told Eve, "See yourself, and you shall know. We have known. It is terror, and it is joy." The final entry, at the bottom of the soaked page, consisted only of 3 words. He is risen. What she meant, who he was, no one can say. Church rumor concluded satanic passion. Secular historians cite guilt-induced hallucination. Yet the coincidence that the James flooded that very week, as if expelling its secret, gnawed at even the skeptics. By winter, the locality around the brookland stood deserted. The soil there emitted a metallic scent, and small animals were found drowned in shallow puddles. Hunters crossing the field near dusk spoke of hearing a woman singing beneath the earth. First faint, then loud enough to drive horses wild. In Richmond itself, elites tried to erase any trace of connection. The Brotherhood became an open secret no gentility would name. The burned homes were demolished, records shredded. But the ground does not forget, and shame has its own liturgy. A strange moral contagion swept through the city during the 1850s. Confessionals overflowed. Women fainted mid-prayer, claiming the water calls. Some blamed cholera epidemics, others feminine nerves. Though the bodies multiplied, physicians treated only symptoms, not causes. One, more courageous than most, told the Whig, "If this is sickness, it is bred of conscience." Even years later, when the Civil War came and fire consumed much of Richmond again, troops bivouacked near those cursed fields reported something unnatural. One corporal wrote to his wife, "We watered the horses at the old well the locals warned against. At midnight my reflection in the bucket smiled, though my face did not. I struck the water, but it rippled toward me. There is rot here that gunpowder cannot burn." He shot himself 2 days later. The story's true horror is not gore, but resonance. The way those women's yearning for power, born of oppression, remanifested in generation after generation, each time disguised by other names. Some modern scholars interpret the Profane Brotherhood as proto-feminist revolt, contorted by its own context. Women denied autonomy, clinging to the only dominion they knew, twisting moral chains in reverse. Others insist it was pure corruption camouflaged as philosophy. Yet the physical evidence, the corpses, the brands, the mirror shards, and the chill that even now breathes through the soil suggest the possibility that something beyond them fed on that turmoil. Perhaps they opened a door between master and slave, oppressor and oppressed, and the thing that stepped through was neither. In 1903, construction workers laying telephone wires north of the river unearthed a human skeleton. It lay outside the boundaries of any known cemetery, wrapped not in shroud, but in chit of silk, embroidered with a serpent. The skull bore delicate features. Female, mid-30s. The body had been interred upright. Around its neck hung a lead token engraved LB 1849. The remains were quietly stored in the State Medical College, labeled only Specimen 47A, until a curator decades later recognized the initials. The bones were Lydia Brooks, rested at last, though rest might be too generous a word for a woman whose legend refused burial. During examination, assistants noted faint discoloration on the forearms resembling burns in circular pattern. Under ultraviolet light, the marks formed letters, aqua meminit, Latin for the water remembers. No mordant could have survived a century. Scientists called it coincidence. The pious called it proof. The ledger, recovered earlier, ends with a postscript added by another hand, presumably Ellen's, before her disappearance. If the brother in the water sleeps, keep him dreaming. Should he wake, heaven will see what we saw and tremble. Even as metaphor, it chills. To believe its literal meaning is to believe they conjured consciousness within reflection, a spirit neither wholly human nor divine, born from every gaze that sought power through domination. The thought of such a being, echoing beneath each mirror, enslaving in return, explains perhaps why many still drape their household looking glasses before thunderstorms. One last artifact completes the circle. In 1912, when renovation crews demolished the last remains of the Page Mansion, they found a sealed room beneath the staircase. Inside were 6 mirrors faced inward, surrounding a small stool. On the back of each mirror, scratched by nail, the same inscription repeated, "We tend souls here." The superintendent who discovered it sold the decor to an antiques dealer without reporting to authorities. Months later, that dealer's shop flooded after a pipe burst, only his mirror stock submerged. Neighbors described water leaking from the seams of doors long before firefighters arrived, as if the mirrors themselves had filled and overflowed. What began as moral sickness in 1849 spiraled into an enduring haunting of reflection itself. The Brotherhood's fatal irony was that they sought equality by reenacting oppression until the act of seeing and being seen became indistinguishable from consumption. To be mirrored was to be devoured. If you were to stand today at the site where their estate once stood, now a cluster of half-forgotten lots between industrial warehouses, you might feel nothing extraordinary, only the drone of traffic and the shadow of the James sliding by. Yet locals say that when light catches muddy ruts after rain, you can glimpse another face under the surface, yours perhaps, or not quite yours, until ripples erase it. On certain nights the smell of iron returns, though no factory nearby burns metal anymore. Thus their story ends where it began, with women staring into water, trying to glimpse what men denied them, and finding instead the reflection of every cruelty ever cast upon them. Power won through desecration turns to curse. Rebellion without compassion conjures its inverse. The profane brotherhood may not have called demons that summer in Richmond. Perhaps they simply revealed the one already present in human heart, the hunger to own and to atone at once. If you stood in that room, surrounded by those mirrors, watching faces merge under candlelight, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. When the century turned and the bright machines of modernity drowned the old cadences of Richmond's bells, the legend of the profane brotherhood had fled into undertone, a name whispered by archivists, avoided by descendants, erased from polite print. Yet its shadow clung to the city's edges, staining law, religion, and collective conscience. The official aftermath was silence, a most southern form of justice. No courtroom ever weighed the deaths. No pastor uttered their names in memorial. Ellen Page's line vanished into rumor. Her father's estate sold after the war to pay debts. Marion Dupre's family name lived on only through distant Louisiana relatives who refused any connection. And of Lydia Brooke, only that token in the medical archive remained. Still, traces kept surfacing. During Reconstruction, Northern journalists rummaged through abandoned courthouses hunting lost records and scandal to sell. In 1869, the Philadelphia Ledger printed a sensational piece titled "The Witches of Richmond," describing women of noble blood practicing their power upon the enslaved. Southern media denounced it as Yankee slander, yet letters written to the editor from locals admitted certain unholy meetings of memory. Those who had lived through the events, now aged and cautious, began to confess small corners of truth near deathbeds. A bedridden jurist, none other than Magistrate Wythe, summoned a young seminarian to record his last admission. "If you dig beneath our stone respectability," he whispered, "you'll find the bones of our own wives." He died before elaborating, leaving that single sentence like a signature beneath the city's history. The social wound reopened in subtler ways. Newspapers of the 1870s described random bouts of mass hysteria at girls' academies, pupils fainting, chanting in unison, one scratching serpentine symbols into her palms. Doctors called it mirror fever, assuming it contagious imagination. The girls recovered, but the pattern traced perfectly the site of the Page Seminary's relocated campus, built from stones salvaged from her father's demolished home. Local theologians, meanwhile, wove the brotherhood into morality tales. Pamphlets printed for Sunday schools warned that the mind unguided by man's order may call upon darkness in seeking light. These warnings turned the brotherhood from historical scandal to cautionary myth. By vilifying its women, the narrative conveniently excused the men who once enabled them. But beneath sermons and textbooks, a quieter reckoning brewed. Black preachers who'd inherited pulpits from freed ancestors sometimes referred obliquely to the water temptation, the moment when sin's reflection drowned those who thought themselves master. For them, the legend served as parable, that every cruelty mirrors itself back upon its author. Oral tradition kept that interpretation alive long after the whitewashed history faded from libraries. Letters from freedmen to the Freedmen's Bureau echo this sense of haunted moral balance. One anonymous writer in 1867 mentioned a spirit in the James that drags only whites down when they speak proud. He described nets tearing in calm water, bodies rising days later marked with an S burned into their shoulders, a simplified remnant of the serpent bee emblem, perhaps etched not by hand but by fear. In 1888 came the first academic attempt at explanation. Professor Ezra Lenthal of the University of Virginia published Occult Feminities of the Antebellum South, arguing that the Brotherhood represented psychological rebellion against confinement. His tone dripped with patronage, but also awe. "If philosophy makes tyrants of men," he wrote, "then the sorcery of these women was their philosophy, murderous but logical." The college burned a printing of the monograph after church petitioning, yet surviving copies circulated clandestinely among proto-suffragists. They read in those pages a twisted mirror of their own struggle, and began referring to forbidden desires as drinking from the James. Lenthal himself died 6 months later of deliberate laudanum overdose, or so his wife claimed. His last paper, found in his desk, bore pencil marks resembling snakes biting their tails. The modern city began paving over its old terrain. Warehouses rose where estates had stood, trolleys humming across ground once planted with tobacco. Foundation diggers routinely struck old wells, and every time they did, papers noted the unbearable smell, not rot exactly, nor sulfur, but something artificial, like lamp fuel and mold together. The workers joked about ghost light, nervous laughter masking instinctive revulsion. They covered the holes quickly, claiming superstition, but none volunteered to work sundown shifts. A century later, the museum world entered, armed with gloves, catalogs, and righteous curiosity. 1932 saw the Valentine Museum quietly accepting donation of the notorious ledger. To avoid scandal, curators labeled it only private devotional record, so 1840s. Yet reading rooms attracted odd disturbances. Droplets forming on sealed display glass, faint humming when lights dimmed. One intern swore a handwritten word appeared mid-page where blank space had been. Obedience. The mark vanished when observed by others. World wars came and went, crumbling illusions of Southern gentility far more effectively than the Brotherhood ever could. Still, the fascination lingered. By the 1960s, graduate theses and folklore tours resurrected the legend as early feminist resistance. The 1980s made it true crime commodity. But among descendants, through blood acknowledged or denied, the story remained bruised and personal. At family reunions of Brooke, Page, and Dupro lines, guests still avoided one topic: the Serpent Summer. Public rediscovery struck in 1997, when renovation of a downtown office basement, built atop what had been St. Paul's carriage lot, exposed a shallow chamber. Inside lay 3 panes of antique mirrors set behind trapped glass. The city historian overseeing the excavation said later they were reflecting each other endlessly, like some frozen equation. When we uncovered the last layer of dirt, all our lanterns flickered green. The mirrors shattered upon removal, unprovoked. Workers fled. Scientists blamed unstable mercury silvering reacting with humidity. But when fragments were tested, traces of human blood were present within the metallic backing, old, degraded, yet unmistakable. The shards rested briefly at the university before disappearing under circumstances politely called misplacement. By then, Richmond's citizens had grown almost fond of their ghosts. Tour guides dramatized the Well of the Serpent. Cafe menus borrowed the name. Poets romanticized Lydia as martyr. Each retelling cleaned the blood off history's floorboards, while the true ache, the human tragedy of power and subjugation, remained half-spoken. Still, a few refused dilution. Modern researchers, diving through baptism archives and oral histories, mapped families of the enslaved men named in that original ledger. Descendants still living on the city's East End spoke with dignity, not revenge. One, Reverend Curtis Ames, put it plainly in a 2018 interview. What those ladies did wasn't witchery. It was what happens when a soul tries to climb the wrong stair out of hell. Our people were used as rungs. The devil don't need horns when folks make a ladder of bodies. His church stands less than a mile from where the Brook Well once gaped. Every November, on the night the James floods most, congregants walk in silent procession to the river's edge, lay white flowers, and sing in deep unison, not hymns backward, but forward. So the city endures, refleshed around its wound, never truly healed. The Brotherhood's deeds seeded lessons woven into law and folklore. The collision of piety and desire, propriety and violence, reflection and guilt. Each time water darkens at dusk, Richmond glances at its own surface and sees 2 faces, the luminous one it presents to tourists, and the shadowed one that still whispers from the current below. In that mingling of flow and memory, the 1849 summer never ended. It runs like an undertow, unseen but felt, reminding the living that every civilization builds its brightness atop whatever it refuses to face. In the end, the Profane Brotherhood was less a coven than a mirror, one that showed Richmond the face it most wanted to deny. Their rituals blurred lines between sin and justice, faith and cruelty, until reflection itself became contagion. Perhaps that's why the city never buried their story, because it wasn't finished and maybe never will be. Stand by the James on a quiet night and you may feel it, the breath of water rising like memory, the hint that every society hides its own forbidden mirror somewhere beneath its churches and courthouses. We look down, see our twin looking back, and pretend it's only shadow. So what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled, or buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments. And if you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story. Because the past, as Richmond learned, never fully dies.